Terry now for only a couple of years, but we've become good friends, and it seems like I've known him a long time. I can't think of anyone better to talk about the creative spirit, since he certainly is one. and he will, I'm sure, tell you a little bit about himself and how he came to be very interested in this particular topic. But he is a movie producer in Hollywood, has worked on many movies. One that you've undoubtedly all heard of is The Terminator. He had a lot to do with that movie. and but the most recent one was a documentary on Desmond Doss, who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for all that he did during the Second World War. What made him unique was that he was a conscientious objector. And he was certainly in the thick of battle, but he did not carry a gun. And so, anyway, this has been an award-winning documentary. It's won first prize in several film festivals. So it's very good. But Terry is very creative, involved in movies, plays, getting ready to do a book, and so he's very creative. And for me, I'm a frustrated musician, and I started out with, I was going to major in piano performance. Well, I got over that. So did something else, but I really appreciate people who think outside of the box. It nurtures my soul to be around people who are creative. And maybe that's why I like Terry, because he is that kind of person. So Terry, we're very happy that you're here. And we're going to have this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon. Now, we don't really have to be so scattered out. We have a lot more chairs than people. And if we wanted to just sit all close in kind of a circle, then he might sit down instead of stand up too. Anyway, that's up to you folks who are sitting back moving forward. Feel free.
Yeah, that would be fine. That would actually be a good idea, because I'd rather have it be as intimate as you'll allow it to be. Because I'm basically a shy guy, so.
That's hard to believe, but it's true.
But it's true. It really is true. So if you guys are okay with it, let's, if you kind of come in the front row and we'll just kind of circle the wagons, so to speak. And if you start getting antsy, I think we'll take a couple of breaks and
we have some bottled water out there at our break time. If you want some water?
put my phone here on stun so my wife will interrupt us. My kids, maybe. Let's start with prayers. Lord, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share some biblical principles and truths with everyone here, and I look forward to everyone else contributing as well, some of their thoughts and comments and experiences as well, in light of the fact that we're all here to complete your mission and with the gifts that you've given us, and with our thoughts and our lips as well. I ask these things in your name. Amen. Well, this is the hardest part for me, is getting started. And the reason is because usually I start by talking about myself, which is the most uncomfortable thing for me to do. And the reason why I usually start with that is because my experience growing up is not terribly unique. some respects, it was kind of like a Catholic and a Christian getting together. Their views were that much different about Adventism in general. And so when I came along, there was some conflicting questions about how to raise kids, and not to mention the fact that they were very young, 19 years old. And as I got into being about 5 years old, Christian will appreciate this because he's a musician and pianist. I voiced my desire to play percussion, to play drums, and my parents said, "Well, you can't do that because those aren't musical instruments. So you need to play the piano." Now, the interesting thing about that is, as I've reflected back on it, is that we didn't have a television when I was growing up. My parents thought that I didn't need to be unduly influenced by media at the time. I have 2 sisters, by the way, that are younger than I am. And so we didn't have a television until I was 10 years old. And what we listened to was, for the most part, classical music. So I grew up as a child really strictly on classical music. In fact, I didn't hear any really alternative forms of music until I was probably 12 years old. And the first thing I heard other than classical music was when my cousin sat me down and he played the album Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd. So I went from Beethoven and Strauss and Bach and Mozart to Pink Floyd. So and mind you, I was listening to headphones, so you can imagine the experience in addition. And it was mind-boggling for me. It was an experience. So I come back to where I was 5 or 6 years old. Why or how could I have known that I wanted to play percussion? Because typically we think of percussion in a rock and roll setting for the most part. I mean, those of us that are familiar with orchestra, obviously there's a percussion section. And I've thought about that. And in thinking back about it, I was drawn to the fact of the timpanis, and I love the timpanis. And I remember listening to a lot of the music when I was a little boy and hearing the power as well as the melodic sound of the timpanis. And I think that's what was drawing me to that. And I say that, and I'll get to the end of this story in just a second. But let me take you on this little journey of what my parents decided. So they decided to have me start the piano. Well, that lasted about 1.5 years, and I became very unhappy and wouldn't practice and was fighting with my parents about it. And finally said, "Okay, we give up, we quit. You can quit, but you have to play something." So I said, "Okay, well, I'll play the trumpet." Well, I can't to this day tell you why I wanted to play the trumpet. I'm sure I saw somebody playing the trumpet, is probably what it was. So I played the trumpet from about 8 years till I was, I played it about 4 or 5, I played 6 years. So I played the trumpet, and I had nothing short of a little Hitler as my taskmaster, my teacher, my instructor. I mean, he was all about tapping the foot and spanking my hands if I didn't do it right. And that wasn't so much that bothered me as much as it was the fact that I grew tired of playing the trumpet. So I really wasn't terribly passionate about playing the trumpet. So then I told my parents that I wanted to switch over to the French horn, which I did. And that actually soothed me for a while. It was certainly a more challenging instrument to play. But within a couple of years, it just didn't last. And this came at about a time when I was a junior in high school academy. And by the way, I went to 9 schools in 12 years. So I was moving about instance, I was taken out of a private school that I was going to right before the end of my junior year, and I still had this passion for that was starting to resurface about the percussion thing. Well, when I went to public school at the end of my junior year, the band director, it was first period of the day, and the French horn section, which was all of me and one other guy, sat literally in the percussion section. Well, that was really a great thing for me because it turned out that these guys became my friends. And of course, in a public school, high school setting, there's a marching band aspect. And this happened at a time where there was going to be a Memorial Day parade. And my parents, because I'd been to private school for the most part of my whole life, they were really looking forward to my first experience seeing me marching down the street in a parade playing this French horn. Well, as it turned out, this guy who was supposed to play the cymbals was sick or didn't show up. And so Bobby Snow, my best friend who played percussion, said, Terry, why don't you come in here and jump in here and play the cymbals? And I said, what a great idea. So I did. So I'm marching down the road, slamming these cymbals together, and my parents were mortified, utterly mortified. And in fact, there was the biggest fight I think we ever had later that day after school was over with. And I told them I refused to play anything but the percussion at this point. And that was it. There was nothing they could say or do. They could kick me out, they could do whatever they wanted to, but I was not going to play anything but percussion. And so I did. And in my senior year, it so happened that the major head of the marching band was a senior, and he played timpanis. And so he graduated that year of my junior year, and I took over playing the timpanis and all the kitchen stuff, the chimes, the bells, marimbas, all that kind of thing. And I was in heaven, but I was most in heaven when I played the timpanis, and it showed the first performance that the orchestra, the band/orchestra had. My parents were there, and we were playing this Civil War fantasy piece. It was made up of several different movements, and part of the movement came where this battle happens in the music, and that's where literally, all hell cuts loose. It's a war. And so I took that as I didn't need any motivation to do that. And I slammed my mallet down on the timpani head so hard it went 30 feet in the air. It flew out of my hand. And it's flying up there, and I just grabbed another mallet, and the thing's going to come down somewhere. I think it came down in the clarinet section or something. And the whole audience erupted. I mean, it was amazing. And my parents saw the sheer joy that I had, in performing, and it never was an issue after that. But I saw in them there was this guilt. I could see at times there was this guilt, this regret that they hadn't listened to me as a little boy way back when I was 5 and 6 years old. And I didn't equate just how important that was in the big scheme of my life or anybody else's life at the time. But let me rewind back now to where I was a little boy again, and that is in my schoolwork. My parents, I was a student, and one of the things that my parents really made important were the grades. And I came from a performance-based home. Do you guys know what that is, performance-based home, type A home in Judaism? Where you were assessed and judged on your performance, essentially. If you got good grades, you got a quarter, or you got rewarded. When I played ball, I grew up and loved baseball. When I played baseball and did well, I was rewarded. When I wasn't, somebody was there to either in a critical way or an extra critical way to point out the fact of where I had erred, so to speak. And so I grew up in that kind of home. And it's not to say that my parents didn't love me. I know that they loved me. It's not to say that they didn't care about me, because I knew that they cared about me, but it was their way of parenting, was in a performance-based home. And my mother was more motherly and caring and compassionate than my father. My father, if you ever saw the movie The Great Santini, he was more of an authoritarian type of father figure. But I really looked up to him and I respected him, and because he was really good at what he did, and I wanted to be as good as what he was. Well, one day, for some reason, I liked baking. I liked baking these cream puffs, and so growing up in a Midwestern kind of cowboy setting, I grew up on a farm. So I still wear manifestations of that. My father walked in and saw me baking cream puffs, and to this day I can't actually remember the incident. My mother tells this story. But my father came in and he saw that, and he took the cookie sheet of cream puffs and he threw them in the garbage, and he said, "No son of mine is going to be baking cream puffs." And I blocked it out. To this day, I cannot remember that, but my mother swears that happened. And it was devastating to her because, she just viewed my father as being very narrow-minded about the cowboy way, so to speak. And so, several things like this happened in my life, and yet I did look up to my father. I felt secure with my father, and he was, to me, a man's man. And all my friends thought I had the greatest parents in the world. My mom was attractive, and my friends would say, "Oh, you have a beautiful mom." I said, "What are you? You're crazy, And you have the best parents. My parents are older, and they don't let me do anything. And yet I thought my parents were very restrictive. I mean, coming from an Adventist home, we like to go camping. Well, on Sabbath, how many of you were allowed to get wet on the Sabbath? Okay, we're sort of in the minority. No, were you allowed to put the toe in?
You can put the toe.
Okay, you can put the toe in. But you couldn't get up to the knee or you were in trouble. So we would go backpacking or something and find a way to fall in the water, and get wet. We're very much about staying within the lines. And yet, my mother was an interior designer, so she's very creative. My father, even though he was a businessman, was a very creative. After he quit racing, he was a very creative man and invented different types of tools for the interior design business, and he had a boutique retail store and all that, and went on to work for an international company. But nonetheless, somehow something was missing. And I grew up wanting to be Indiana Jones, an archaeologist. I grew up wanting to be that combined with doing some forest ranger type things. I love the outdoors and I loved history. And I loved the idea of touching history when I go to museums, and that I love touching old things because it just kind of spoke to me, I could feel the character oozing out, and it took me back to another time, and all this imagery would come up in my mind about where this piece must have been and whatnot. Well, I got some bad counsel when I was a senior in high school after having taken the usual exams, entrance exams, to see how smart you are, to where you're going to be allowed to go to school. And my scores were such that the counselor said, "Well, you can do anything you want to do, anything, and you can probably pretty much go just about anywhere you want to go." And that's not what I needed to hear. What I needed to hear was what my calling was. Where was I gifted? But I didn't get that advice. And so when I graduated, I didn't know where I was going to go to school because I changed my mind about being an archaeologist after I was told I was going to have to be very politically minded in terms of trying to apply for grants and find money so I could go dig in the dirt somewhere. And that just didn't sound appealing to me. Well, it so happened that I decided, well, I would go into veterinary medicine since I grew up in a rural setting, and I loved riding horses and that, and I decided to do that. Well, I no more decided to do that than my cousin, who worked for Dr. Bailey, the baby heart surgeon at Loma Linda, that did the baboon hearts and the babies and whatnot. My cousin worked for him, and he said, well, if you're going to be a veterinarian, why don't you be a real doctor and just come on out here? I said, okay. So it was that easy, which said a lot about how passionate I was about being a veterinarian. And you want to pay attention to that word passion, because that's a very important adjective. So I went to Loma Linda, and while I was waiting to get into pre-med school, I saw this episode of Starsky and Hutch on television. And I was so naive, I didn't realize that it was in syndication, which means it's in reruns. You know, it's been sold off to some other lesser channel, and I saw this story, this episode, and thought, I can write better than that. And I sat down to write a short story. And I waited till the end of the credits and saw who the production company was, and I wrote this short story. In fact, I didn't even know how to type. My mother had to type the story for me because I wrote it out in longhand. So I sent it in, and the secretary called back a couple weeks later and asked who I was. And as she inquired to who I was and realized I had just graduated out of high school, she put me on hold, came back and said, listen, we would like to set up some interviews for you at USC, UCLA, and Pepperdine. And it was at that moment that my whole life changed, because I went on those interviews, and I had 3 people after I went to UCLA and USC, and decided those schools weren't right for me, partly because of their sheer size. I was used to a small town kind of setting, more intimate. When I went to Pepperdine, I felt totally at home and at peace for the first time, I think, in a long time. And the 3 department heads that helped me and met me at Pepperdine single-handedly chose every single class that I took at Pepperdine, except for some upper division senior courses. And I had what they call, which you all know, is an interdisciplinary major in theater and broadcast journalism and communication, which included creative writing. And so these people were very visionistic in what they saw something in me. I had, mind you, no portfolio, no examples of my ability whatsoever. And this is a pretty exclusive school. You just don't slide in there. And I cannot tell you to this day, except for divine intervention, that I was allowed to go to that school. Yes, I had good grades, but that doesn't always count. So when I told my parents that I was going to go into the movie business and be a writer and director, the timpani, the percussion episode, was only a minor thing on the Richter scale. My father about lost his, he didn't have religion at the time, but he almost didn't live to see another day. I mean, it just deeply disturbed him. And so it turned out to be a big fight, not only for that day, for the next 4 years that I went to Pepperdine until the day I graduated, and he picked me up, and he was living in Colorado at the time, Denver. And I went there, and he asked me, well, now what are you going to do with your life? You spent all this money, and I was on full scholarship. But he said, what are you going to do now? And we had one of those cutting the strings, the child cutting the strings from the parent conversations. And it was right before Christmas, and it was the first Christmas I didn't spend with my father. And it was extremely painful for my father, because he knew that something was grossly wrong. He couldn't reconcile the fact of just happened. He lost his son, and he thought it was over. He didn't know how to deal. He couldn't cope. He was on drugs. He was taking Valium or something, And me, I was just really upset. I was just flat out angry at it because I had put up with this for a long, long time, and I just had it. Well, I got out of school, and I had applied for an MFA program at UCLA, and they only accepted 3 students a year into the directing theater MFA program. Very highly politicized, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted, and it got to be a week before I was supposed to start classes, and I withdrew, which made a whole lot more people unhappy. And I withdrew because I got a job, an offer to work with Haskell Wexler, who is an Academy Award-winning cinematographer who did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Natural. He did one of the most beautiful pictures ever made called Secret of Romanish, Mate One. But this man was a living legend, and I took the opportunity to work with him and serve as an apprentice, as it were, kind of like the old days, where you study under the master. And his partner was Conrad Hall, and Conrad Hall was the cinematographer for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Which he won the Academy Award for. He won the Academy Award, which he got right before he died, for American Beauty. He did The Road to Perdition. They both just were amazing men, and so those were my first 2 experiences working with someone from Hollywood. Now that wasn't terribly meaningful to my father and my mother, although I did hear through the grapevine that they were having these conversations with their friends like, hey, my son's working with Haskell Wexler, but they would never tell me that, They would never share any of that with me. It wasn't until my father sat in the theater next to me with a film that I had written, produced, and directed that he realized that his son was an artist, and he was willing to admit that. And that was a difficult moment for him because he had to acknowledge then that he had done some things as a parent that he not only deeply regretted, he felt like, he had even damaged me and even for that matter, probably my sisters. And I think my mother had similar feelings. And I want to say at this point too that when I left, having grown up as an Adventist and going to church and doing all those things that we do as kids growing up in the Adventist faith, that I left the church the moment I left home because my creative spirit had been crushed. It had been so stomped on, even in unintentional ways, and some intentional, but mostly unintentional, that religion, organized religion especially, made absolutely no sense in its relevancy to my life. And we all have seen how each youth generational, each generation of youth, for the most part, walks away from organized religion. And there are reasons for that, and that's one of the reasons why I do what I do now in terms of speaking to that age group especially. I walked away not knowing that my father used to do that too. I walked away not knowing that my spirit had been crushed, and I was not smart enough and analytical enough at that point, and had any sort of perspective as well to figure all that out. But God has a way of fixing things that we screw up, And so I'm kind of living proof of that, which is why I like to feel compelled to share my part of the story. And that's because the other thing is that even if I were going to be, an upright, standing, pillar of our community, there was no place I could go in our educational system to even get trained properly to go into the arts, because quite frankly, not only our denomination, but many denominations don't embrace the arts, except for things like what Christian does, and those of you who are pianists, and if you have the right vibrato, like Michelle, then you're more easily accepted. But in terms of fine art, media art, filmmaking, what have you, writing, that's not really ever been embraced or terribly encouraged. There's a reason for that. So I didn't really have a lot of options at that point. Now, through my Hollywood experience, like Dr. Babcock said, I was barely out of school when I got the opportunity, and when I was doing these commercials, working with Haskell and Conrad, to go and work on the Terminator. And so that was quite an experience for me. And what I did on that film was I worked on what they call the stunt unit, the second unit. So that's where all the stunts and all the effects, all the wizardry and gadgetry, all the illusion of filmmaking happened. And we created pretty much mayhem. That was our job. And hopefully nobody gets hurt. And I developed a reputation for working as an assistant director and production manager, production supervisor, doing these types of films, action pictures, where they required a second unit. And I developed relationships with producers like Peter McGregor Scott, who had produced a couple of the Batmans and some of the Steven Seagal movies, which I worked on. And during the mid-90s, it reached a point where I was, again, unfulfilled. And I had to deal with that. And I dealt with it right in the middle of the film set, where I told the producer, I told Peter, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't, my blood pressure isn't moving. I'm just standing here, it's like, who cares? And we're about ready to wreck half a city block. And he said, well, what are you going to do? Because I was at a point, his next picture was The Fugitive. And he wanted me to produce the big train wreck at the beginning of the movie. That was going to be 14 cameras. And he wanted me to do that. And I said, I can't do it anymore. It's just, I need to get on the creative side of the camera, meaning directing and writing. And I had co-written this script with a friend of mine. And I had an opportunity to direct it. And so I said, I've got to go do this. Well, and he said, fine, we'll do another picture sometime down the road. Well, that came at a time where I was just getting ready to go what they call over the top, meaning that I was going to start making more money than I knew what to do with. And that was like in the 7-figure range. So I was passing up a huge opportunity to now drop back down, do a little no-name independent film for about $1.5 million, and make a go of it. My experience was so rough, and I didn't enjoy it as an artist, that I left and went to Ireland, because I'd never been so, I had people sabotaging because they wanted power, and I had people sabotaging because they wanted recognition, and I had people, the dynamics, and here I am, I'm an experienced assistant director and producer. I know these things go on, but when I got to be a director, I thought, okay, I'm going to be able to manage this. But it was unbelievable the things that I was going through. So I went to Ireland and said, you know what? I've proven to everybody I can write, I've proven to everybody I can direct, I've proven to everybody I can produce. I'll go do something else. Forget it. So have any of you seen the film Waking Ned Divine? Is that a funny film or what? If this film, it's a great story about a little town in Ireland, and this little town, when I say it's little, I mean, they have thatched roof, not huts, but houses, and it's, I went to Ireland and lived in a town like that. Ballydehock was the name of the town, southwest Ireland. Well, are any of you familiar with the Cliffs of Moher? Well, the Cliffs of Moher are an amazing natural wonder, and I was at the Cliffs of Moher. And when it comes right down to it, basically, I was challenging God to give me a reason to either step forward or step back, and I needed a reason to wake up in the morning because I just didn't have a reason. I wasn't married at the time, and so I needed a reason. Well, obviously I'm here today, so I didn't take the step forward. But what happened was that something told me not to take that step forward. And later that day, I went to a little cafe, and in that cafe, and I had the biggest touristy looking map. It was 5 feet long and had every path in Ireland. And sitting next to me was this gray-haired lady and a gray-haired man. The man looked like he was from The Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway's story. I mean, he just chiseled. His face was like leather. And the woman saw me and she said, "Are you on holiday?" And I didn't want to say, "Well, no, I was just going to step off the cliffs there." I said, "Oh, yeah." And she said, "Well, you know, Eric here," and she asked me what I did, and I said, "Well, you know, I just wrote and directed this picture, little picture." And he said, "Oh, really? Eric here's a writer." And I said, "Oh, that's nice." And she said, "Well, Eric, do you know who he is? Eric Hogarth." It's like, I didn't know who Eric Hogarth was. Well, he's a well-known Danish writer who's translated a lot of Hans Christian Andersen's work in English. And he lives in this 600-year-old boathouse. It has this old Roman aqueduct, the remains of it going across this little bay, lagoon, I should say. And he lives in this one of these places that's like out of one of the old masters' pieces of art. I mean, it's like where the little boats, when the tide goes out, you know, they lay on their side because the tide is out 3 miles out. And you know, he takes me to his place, and I'm like taking pictures. I'm not really interested in talking to him. I'm like, you know, oh, this is really great. You know, magic hour comes, the light, the sun's setting, and I'm just shooting film away like I can afford it. So he takes me inside, and there's something about him that he recognizes that not only am I not at peace, but that I need rescuing. And for those of you that are familiar with psychology, you know, I'm sure he wasn't formally trained in it, but he knew just the right thing to say, you know, as opposed to saying, "I'll show you, you need to do this, you need to do that." He somehow nurtured me in a way that he got me to recognize that my life wasn't over, and that I needed to go back to stateside and fulfill what he calls my destiny. And you know, when you hear that word destiny, it's like, okay, it's Star Wars, you know, Yoda's, you know, talking here. And in a sense, you know, he was kind of like a little taller. But he gave me a book that he had written and signed it for me and sent me on my way after a couple of days that I'd spent with him. And I stayed in Ireland probably for another week, went to Scotland, and then went home. And I sat and wrote a script called Learning to Fly, which is kind of a redemptive story. And about the time I finished the script, I came in contact with Desmond and so that was how I began to get on the right path, because when I reconnected with Desmond, I had known his story as a kid, but I realized something just told me, this is why you exist. And so I decided to do the documentary on Desmond Doss. And he was gracious enough to entrust me enough to do his story after refusing for 60 years to not let anybody do the story. He passed up lots of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to not have it done. So that was a 4-year journey for me. And during that journey, and what time is it?
3:15.
Will you guys kind of be the when you guys want to do a little break, you let me know. Let me just get through this story if you guys feel like you need one to take. This 4-year journey for me, I thought that Desmond, and do you all know the story of Desmond Doss? The first conscientious objector to ever receive the Medal of Honor, which is a paradox in of itself. And he was an Adventist, and he's kind of like been the hero in the Adventist denomination. Maybe the most well-known, John Weiner's probably not too far behind. But he's a very humble man, and when I started to do that film, I thought that because Desmond was this great soldier for God, a great Christian role model, he was Christ-like in his behavior, that this would be one of the easiest things I could ever have done. And it turned out to be the most hellish thing I could ever have done. And for having been in the film business at that point, that was 2000, 15 years, I was unbelievable how naive I was about it. And the reason why I was naive was I didn't realize that the war of principalities had something to do with this whole thing. And so it was a war that I went through, and we'll go into a little more of that as we talk about this creative spirit. But I'm here today having survived it, and one of the things that that project and being with Desmond has taught me is that what it's like to walk a faith walk and not know how you're being fed in the morning, how you're going to live and pay next month's bills, and as well as be able to not just be ready to end your life, and have hope, and security and confidence that you're going to be taken care of. And so, and during this process was when it all came together for me, because I was having people come up to me and saying various things that I never heard before. Like things like when they saw the film. By the way, I was on the film festival circuit for 2 years, and the film has won, all kinds of awards. I've lost track of them. We won 65% of all the film festivals we were ever in, which nobody wins that kind of ratio. And 2 weeks ago, I was given this bridge award from the General Conference for bridge building to the outside world. But going back to this point, people would come up to me after they'd seen the film and they'd say, you know what, you were really inspired. This film is an inspired film. Well, at first it made me feel really, really uncomfortable, because I had been told the only person who was inspired was Ellen White. And yet, I asked for inspiration every day when I worked on that film. I had told Desmond that this was a godly project, and it was God's project as much as it was So I asked for all those things on a daily basis of God, and I held him responsible for how this project was going to turn out, because he knew where my commitment was to it, and it was 100%. I told Desmond I wouldn't compromise one iota on it. Well, there were plenty of people inside and outside the denomination that wanted me to compromise and thought I was way off the scale at times, because of my unwillingness to compromise. But Desmond had taught me well from his story that if you compromise once, you can compromise again. And that is a slippery slope to go down. And so I was set. I was predetermined that I wasn't going to do that. So what became apparent to me was that I had come full circle because I became at peace. I had never found this kind of peace and happiness, not just peace, happiness, at doing what I was doing and what I had done with the DOS thing. And I realized that I left this little key part out of my childhood story to you, but I realized that I had come full circle. If my parents had realized that when I was also 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that I had been picking up my father's camera and taking pictures with film, and I was taking my sense of composition. Is that my phone? That sounds like my phone. Sorry. That I had. It's all right. I'm used to technology, so it's okay. But I had been taking my father's camera. I had taken a shoebox and made a camera out of a shoebox, and I was taking pictures with that. And when I got old enough, I used other cameras and whatnot. But had my parents and my teachers recognized what I was doing and nurtured me, that I wouldn't have had to go probably on this big detour. I may have. It's always easy to look back. But that somehow, that got missed along the way. And so that's when the light bulb went on for me about this creative spirit thing. And I started studying and reading. And the more I read and the more I studied, the more I got inspired. And the more I got inspired, the more I found, and the more material I found. It was like, there's a big hole here. There's this big black hole that isn't being discussed. And it was a key. I felt like I had been just given the key as part of the answer to why our youth are having such a problem. In and out of not all youth are having this problem, an identity problem. So my first, and are you all ready to take a little 5-minute break? So here we'll take this break. I just wanted to think about these couple of questions over the break. Is it really true that human beings are meant to be creative? Were we born with a creative spirit? And are we supposed to live through that creative spirit? Okay? So that's where we'll start. We'll take whatever kind of break you want, 10 minutes, Michelle, 10 minutes. So let's take a little break, and then we'll have that.
3:30. It's 8. Just outside the door in the foyer, there's a big round table with some pamphlets on it. In front of those pamphlets,
How many, you'll find that I talk a lot about movies because that's where I came from, obviously. I realize that some people don't go see films or watch films as much as I do, but I use that kind of as as examples. How many of you have seen Dead Poets Society?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, almost everybody's seen it. Okay, good. Well, that's good. You know, you remember Dead Poets Society is all about the creative spirit. It's about a young man whose parents obviously didn't embrace that, especially his father, and he ended up, committing suicide because of it. And he was so unfulfilled, and that certainly happens in today's society, and it's happened for a long time. It's very unfortunate, very sad. Let me grab my Bible here. Being part of my life, being a writer, words are very powerful, obviously, and words are how we communicate, and but if they're not exclusive to communication anymore. These three questions that I have proposed to you, and by the way, if you have comments or questions, again, I want to encourage you to feel free to speak up. So these are the three questions, and there's a fourth I'm going to throw at us here too. So kind of there are thesis questions, I guess. Is it really true that human beings are meant to be creative? Were we born with a creative spirit, and are we supposed to live through that creative spirit? And here's the fourth one. How were we created? Okay. Hey, nobody's phone is rung yet. If we were created in God's image, are we all on the same page? We all believe we were created in God's image. Do we really believe that? I guess that's the big question: is do we really believe we were created in God's image? All right. So those first three questions about being creative, are going to become more relevant here as we go along real quick. If we were created in God's image, what must he be like? Does God laugh? Does he cry? Does he get angry? Does he have a sense of humor? Is it possible to be a God of perfect love and not have feelings or emotion? Is God creative? Is God creative? I don't want to lead us down the wrong path now. All right, we all believe God's creative. I make the assumption that with us all that God created this earth, and that's a pretty good example of it. Does God use creative art forms to communicate?
Birds, flowers, trees.
Okay.
I consider those art forms.
Okay, good.
Tabernacle service with sculptor.
Okay,
Why did you choose that for?
that's right. That's a really good question, and we want to address the whys. Okay, anybody else? Music. Okay. Biblically speaking, what can you guys think of some examples that God actually creatively communicated with us?
Moses and burning bush.
Okay, good.
Well, he used the liturgy of David. David wrote all the Psalms, and without that, we wouldn't have a connection with that love
Right.
that David had for the Lord.
Right. That's good, but that's David doing that.
But he got inspired by
Here,
something.
that's right. Well, we'll get to that. I'm looking for examples where God directly, himself, okay, okay. So she's talking about Christ, okay.
There's rainbow after the flood.
Okay, good.
Symbols in Revelation.
Symbol, okay, good. All right. How about the hand writing on the wall in Nebuchadnezzar's?
Yeah.
How about his? Yeah. Okay. What say that?
The cloud with Israelites.
Yes, that's on my list here.
Crossing of Jordan.
Crossing of Jordan, okay.
Red Sea.
What's that?
Red Sea.
Read the parting in the Red Sea, yes.
Actually, when Moses, Moses was covered and he turned his back and you can only see the essence of God.
Okay, this is a good one. You know, my example that I have on my list is when God passed by Elijah. Did you remember that story? What's that?
It's still a small place.
Yes, but what happened right before that? There was the wind that was tearing up the mountains and splitting rocks. There was the earthquake, fire. Why do you think God did all that? Was it just to show he was God and he was all powerful, or was he making some other kind of statement?
Well, that was the same mountain he did it the first time with the Israelites, and that's how he did it the first time. So is he saying the second time, like before, now I'm just speaking, like striking the rock and speaking? Is he following that same?
Does God do anything by accident? I think that he's using creative forms of communication because we as humans, he enabled us to have the five senses. If he only were going to speak to us, all we'd have to have is ears. We wouldn't really need to see anything. Right? Ears. Here are a couple of statements that I throw out for your perusal. I mean, when he's communicating, and we ask that why, could it be that he wants to show us using whatever creative means necessary to illustrate his love? All right. If you have a Bible, you're more than welcome to follow along. If you don't, next time, hopefully I'll have some more visual aids. You would think I would have done that already, being a visual person, but I apologize. Genesis 1:26. How did God create us? Now, just so you know, I don't exclusively use the New Revised Standard Version, but since it is one of the more literal translations, and wordsmithing, and going back to the original Hebrew and Greek, I tend to use this translation probably a little more than others. But in Genesis 1:26, this is where we find out how God made us. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." And then he talks about having dominion over the whole earth and birds and all that stuff. Then on verse 27 he says, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." 3 times it says right here, just to make sure that we understand, we were created how?
In God's image.
In God's image. 3 times he says it. What does that mean?
Does it go beyond just the visual? Does it also include the mental capacity to create, even in our own little finite space, as in cinematography, art, writing?
Well, yeah, you're starting to get on dangerous ground for some people. If you look, let's look at the model he set up here. He says, here's the model he gives us. Let us make humankind in our own image, according to our likeness. And then he says, and let them have dominion. What does dominion mean? You're going to rule. You're the king. You're going to rule. Over all the fish of the sea, over the birds, blah, 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 all everything, the whole earth. Okay? So then he says, so then it's repeated 3 times. We're going to we're made in the image of God. And then he says, in verse 28, God blessed them, meaning Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. There's that word again, over everything essentially. Okay, I'm obviously summarizing that there. So he essentially set this earth up for us to be, dare I say, like many gods, all right, many kings, all right. Did he give us the ability to create? Well, we certainly have the ability to procreate. You know, we have the ability to, like you said, aspects of our personality and soul have the ability to create. Can we do, you know, godlike things and create the universe? No, that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying here is the original model that God gave us was to rule this earth and to use the abilities that he gave us. Now let's look at which brings up us to the next text. Look at, if you have, look up Genesis 3:7 says, "Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living thing." Now, in Genesis, especially here at the beginning, you see these little phrases, and then we're on to the next thing. And yet these little phrases are such monstrous.
That was 2:7.
That's 2:7, I'm sorry, 2:7. They're such monstrous ideas and concepts. Did God, in creating everything else in the earth, use his breath?
Yes.
Did he? He spoke it.
He spoke it.
But was it his breath? Was it his living, soulful breath?
I think that's the only time when he made himself part of what he was creating.
Right. He was making a commitment. We're connected to him forever that way. He used part of himself to give us, to create us. He gave part of himself to make us happen. That to me, I mean, when I really started studying this, that was just like this huge idea I mean, it was just a huge commitment. He knew what he was doing. He was giving. And you know, as humans, when we breathe out, what do we breathe out? Carbon dioxide. That's not what God breathes out. That whole concept just kind of blew my mind when I figured that part out. I mean, that was like, that was amazing to me. And he didn't give us CPR when he breathed into us, right? Because his breath contained, and you know what I think it was? It was his love for life. Because as soon as he breathed into us, we became alive. He had oneness with us at that point. If we just think of the imagery of him doing that, what must he have been feeling at the moment that he did that? He had already created the earth, created all these animals, and you imagine that, was the whole universe watching him do this creation thing? So if the whole universe is watching him, this one moment, you've seen in movies, you know, where the camera gets in really tight, you know, and you're on close to this really intimate moment. And you see just faces or parts of faces. You know, and you see, you know, God stick his mouth down on Adam's face and just breathe into him. What was he feeling at that point? What was he thinking? I mean, we tend to think, you know, God being stern and you know, wiping people off the face of the earth, and if you don't do this, you're done. You're history. You're dead. But here's a moment where we're in a close-up. We're in this extreme close-up with God and the first man, and it's a very intimate moment. Yet the whole universe is watching this. They've never seen anything like this before. And yet, all it is one little phrase in this whole big, thick book. There's no elaboration on it. I'm disappointed. Because I wanted to know more.
That's where your imagination comes in.
But you have to be creative for that. if God is creative and he made us in his image, what does that make us? In verse verse 28, where I mentioned, he blessed us and he said, be fruitful and multiply, have dominion and rule. So Adam and Eve set out to do that. Now, what was their first act? What was their first creative act? I know some of you have heard me mention this.
Created a place to live.
Yeah, they did that, but there's the first example. It's written in here. You can guess. It's okay. Yes. Okay. Let's in verse it's Genesis 2, verse 19. Here it says, so out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was his name. Now here's another phrase that gives us a clue into the character and the creativeness of God and Adam. Here God brings all these animals, single file, whatever, and they're coming along. I mean, obviously it's a very formal thing because he formed and brought them to man, and the reason was to see what he would call them. You can look in any translation and it says the same thing, to see what he would call them. Now, why would God want to see what Adam would call these animals?
He gets to see what he's created. He gets to see the mind that he's given his creation, and to see to observe his own creativeness within his creature.
I think of it as a parent watching my children and saying, what are they going to do next,
That's a great example, and as a kid, as kids, you build things, you build models, or I have a daughter and a son, soon to be 4 and 6, and when I watch them, Caden, my son, will spend all this time getting this big battle together, and all the soldiers have to be just in the right order, and then the joy he has of not just the process, but then the outcome as well. And I know what's going to happen for the most part when I build a model, but it's seeing that model run around, seeing it actually work, and yet God knew the beginning. He knows the beginning from the end. He knew what Adam was going to do. But the only logical reason for him to do this was not because he was tired of having created the world, was because he was going to enjoy, like you said. And the fact is that he passed his legacy on to us through his creative spirit. He knew, and can you imagine Adam sitting there looking at everything from a giraffe to an elephant to an anteater? I mean, these weren't like, okay, he could have named them specimen 1, specimen 2, specimen 3. I mean, he had to be creative. I mean, he didn't have to be, but he was. I can't help but think, and again, this is one of those things where the universe must have been watching, because they were curious what Adam was going to do. And they don't know the beginning of the end like God does, and so that had to be an experience for them. So here we have another little moment in one phrase in the Bible of this very elemental and pivotal, foundational point of who we are, where we came from, what we're about, what we're supposed to be doing. And the thing was that on the next phrase it says here, to see what he would call him, whatever the man called every living creature, that was his name. What could that phrase intimate? Why would God say something that says whatever he named him, that's what it was going to be?
Because he wasn't going to change it.
That's right.
He's going to have to live with the consequences.
That's right.
Now, if we could carry that one step further, every living thing could be the trees, all the plants, all of that
Yes.
could have also fallen
Yes.
into that. But he concentrated on the animal kingdom,
Right.
but it could also have been the flora and fauna as well.
Right. But I think God was saying, look, you know, I trust what I've created. All right? Because the world was perfect at this point. He trusted Adam. And he trusted his creation. That says a lot to us about as parents. All right? We'll get to that at some point here. Okay, Genesis 2:19. That was brought to Manasium, and why would I do this? All right. By the way, I took 6 weeks to name our 2 kids after they were born.
Fill out the certificate at the hospital.
You know, my mother thought it was sacrilegious that our kids left the hospital nameless, and she said, I said, what are they going to do, stuff them back in, you know? But you know, Rebecca and I, names are important. I mean, this is an example where, you know, to God, the names were important to the animals. And, you know, when babies come out of the womb there, you know, sometimes you can't always tell that they're anything other than a mutant alien. But, so I really wanted to, and we searched, literally, I'm telling you, it was 6 weeks. But it wasn't so bad when we went into the pediatrician, by the way, that somebody actually had us beat a record producer that went to the same pediatrician. They took 8 weeks, and their kid's name was Hank.
At least it wasn't Apple. What do you call them all that time?
I don't remember now. Baby girl, baby boy. I don't know. It was baby doe. I think we actually joke around with that. Okay. So anyway, I truly believe that God enjoyed seeing Adam's creative little genius at work in naming these animals. I can't help but believe that. All right. Creative. By definition, if you go to any dictionary, basically by definition, creative means having the ability or power to create. And the second definition usually is followed by characterized by originality and expressiveness and imaginative, which goes to the imagination. So in summary, we can see that living through your creative spirit, and I certainly want to make this very clear. This isn't some new age construct, you know. This goes back to the very beginning, and we know that there are certainly ideas that have come along that seem to fly in the face of all that. So the next big question I have is, which goes to what a couple of you have mentioned, is how or why we have not embraced the God-given creative spirit embedded in us. And one of the things, Pablo Picasso had a quote that said, every child is an artist. And the problem is how to remain an artist after growing up. If we look at, how many of us are parents here? Okay, probably about almost half of us. You know, when you see your kids, or you can visualize yourself when you were kids. I mean, when we were all kids, did you consider yourself having an imagination? Did you use it? Did you feel like you were creative? Did you feel like you were creative?
It's just something you do, thinking about.
Okay, that's a good point. You didn't really.
Until you went to school and they stifled it. You know, they told you to sit down, or they told you you can't do that, or you can't sing, whatever. And then they put these limitations. And you think about God, when God created Adam, he didn't put any really limitations on Adam being Adam.
Okay.
In school, well, in my experience in school, they always stifle the creative genius in people. And that's sad.
Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. I call this the isms. All right? And by definition, an ism is a distinctive doctrine, system, or theory. So some of the isms: traditionalism, formalism, institutionalism, incrementalism, spiritualism, emotionalism. You guys have any extras? Can you think of any others? Traditionalism is the doctrine that all knowledge was originally derived by divine revelation and that it is transmitted by traditions. The doctrine that all knowledge was originally derived by divine revelation and is transmitted by traditions. Formalism is the practice of scrupulous adherence to prescribed or external forms. Institutionalism, adherence to or the belief in established forms, especially belief in organized religion. Incrementalism is social or political gradualism. Spiritualism, a philosophy, doctrine, or religion emphasizing the spiritual aspect of being. And emotionalism, and this is where usually people want to have arguments with those of us who are creative. They say that it's the tendency to display emotion freely or to rely on or place too much value on emotion or undue display of emotion, which I agree with, because pretty much you can use the measuring stick of placing too much value on emotions. That's not a good measuring stick. So this isn't about emotionalism.
Can we add ethnocentrism on
Yes.
that in relationship to religion and how it should be practiced? Has been based on an ethnocentric model, and those outside of it are not worshiping appropriately.
Yes, that's a very good point, especially when culture comes into play and obviously different backgrounds and preferences, and that's a great one. Yes.
Excuse me. It seems to me that some of those isms that you gave the definition of could stifle creativity, because now you're in a cookie cutter mold that everything in traditionalism has to be done this way and you can't deviate from it.
Right.
And a couple of the others that, well, any of those could almost stifle creativity if you follow it to the letter of the law.
Right. That's right. And I was just mentioning during the break that when I was at National Cathedral a few weeks ago, and you walk into that building, you get a sense of awe and reverence as soon as you walk in that building, right? And it reeks of tradition, does it not? And yet, there are good aspects to tradition. There definitely are positive aspects, including giving us a frame of reference, giving us a sense of security, giving us a sense of reverence and awe. And I'm sure that we could, come up with more, but we have to be careful that the isms don't restrict us or imprison us, and that's one of the things that we need to talk about that, and why we need to be acknowledging the isms. One of the other things, you mentioned about about variances, and we've all served on, especially those of you who are in education, you serve on committees, and churches, you serve on committees, and it's one committee on another committee on another committee, and we get into these discussions about what type of music is appropriate, what type of dress, what type of behavior, this, that. We get to the point where it almost becomes it's insanity at times. I mean, to I guess be melodramatic about it. But the fact is that when you really stop and think about it, with God sitting, in the heavens and watching this, when every day there are children dying of severe poverty, there are there's child abuse going on. There's people that have disease rampant raging through their bodies. When we get right down to it, are we mincing and parsing things that we don't really need to get involved with? What What is the priority? Does God have a priority list? These are things I think about in that regard. Parents and educators and theologians, peers, media, you know, they're bombarding our children, all in the good name of molding. Molding. And if you look in word search, molding biblically, there's a passage that Paul talks about where the potter is essentially the creator, you know, has the ability to mold. But there are very few references about molding in the Bible. Certainly not about kids. And definition-wise, molding, and this was very telling to me. It always interests me in the dictionary because if we consider that as a secular mindset coming to defining what words are, but a lot of words come back to a biblical Germanity. Mold, a hollow form or matrix for shaping a fluid or plastic substance, a frame or model around on which something is formed or shaped, a fixed or restrictive pattern or form, to form into a particular shape, to give shape to guide or determine the growth or development or influence. A teacher helps mold the minds of his students. Well, the creative spirit is without form. And as soon as you start hammering that into a mold, what's going to happen?
Less effective.
If it's less effective, less creative.
Looks like everything else has been hammered into that mold.
Yes. You mentioned cookie cutter. That's what happens. You now have a cookie cutter way of thinking, a cookie cutter that some sort of creative cookie cutter result, which after a while it's no longer creative, meaning that's no longer unique. You lose the uniqueness when you go into a cookie cutter mold. So, by the way, Ralph Waldo Emerson, for those of you that haven't seen the film, I have this quote at the beginning that says, "Whosoever would be a man must be a nonconformist." Whosoever would be a man must be a nonconformist. Why would he say something like that? Do you think? What could the reason be? Why would he come up with an idea like that? Why would we even need a nonconformist?
Nonconformists are the ones who put forth change without people who are willing to step outside and remain with the status quo. And so in order to be a man, a person who stands up for what they believe, what they think, in essence, you have to be a nonconformist.
Okay, good. That's great. Yes.
Nonconformists often have a lot of resistance too. So I collect quotations, and a quotation that I really like is Jonathan Ivey is the Vice President for Industrial Design for Apple Computer. And he said, innovation takes an unreasonable man.
Conformists, if there are only conformists, then there are no longer individuals.
Was Jesus a nonconformist?
He was a nonconformist in relationship to earth standards, but he was an absolute conformist in relationship to Islam.
Okay, that's a great explanation. In the perfect universe, conformity is fine because it allows for uniqueness. It allows for creativity. It allows for that creative spirit to fly and fly high.
So why did he decide he didn't want it anymore? He wasn't satisfied with how creative he's allowed to be.
Who?
Lucifer.
That's a really good question. Here was a man who apparently had everything, a being David was a nonconformist. He wrote music and was a musician. He also was a fighter. You know, what was interesting was in the story of Goliath. They're all sitting there paralyzed because they can't think out of the box. All they can see is the usual way of fighting. What's that?
He said, I'll do it. Yeah, but he also spent time with animals in the field, and he did all the things that nobody else really wanted to do in his family. He was the one that went out with nature. He had a relationship more with God. He had a closer knit with God because he understood from his point of view, you know, the way that he was out in the field all the time. I believe that he had such a connection with God.
All right. These examples that I list right here, David, Daniel, Elijah, and Christ, and there's a lot more. They were all nonconformists, but the key elemental component was they had this connection, this direct connection to God. And because of that, it enabled their creativity to fly and fly high and to be able to think outside the box, unlike Saul and the rest of the band, including his brothers. They didn't have that same connection.
You know, the other thing, Jesus, is he was a Torah. He believed in the Torah. What he didn't believe was in the religiosity of the times of the men around him. Because most of the priests and all those people, they had all these rules and these restrictions on him. He had a free reign of being so connected to the Torah. Back then, they didn't have the advantage of having Bibles. So all of this was always taught from one generation down to the next. It was all verbal. It was the power of the word. It was the agape. It was the word that the Lord, that Jesus really, not only got into his heart and his soul, but it became him. The word became him. He and the word were not separated. And that's what I think we all should try to attain to.
Well, and that's right. And the end result of that is something that's pretty amazing. When Elijah, challenged the prophets of Baal, he got pretty creative when he decided what he was going to do. It wasn't enough just to build an altar. I mean, he told a story while he was building that altar, including using 12 stones to build that altar, and decided that he would make sure that he was going to be creative in pouring all that water, not just once, but 3 times, and flooding, essentially. So there was no possibility of any sort of magic going on. I mean, he didn't go to his little book of prophets' magic and look to see, what this thing was going to be, how he's going to pull this thing off. It was only because of his direct connection to God that he had the confidence and the faith to be able to have that kind of creativity and not only looking foolish, but losing his proverbial head off, which was going to happen if he didn't obviously if it didn't work. Here's something, and I liked what you said about Jesus. He spoke in parables, and it wasn't only in parables. He wrote in the dirt. He used nature certainly as object lessons. He healed the afflicted. But here's something that's interesting. When he went into the temple and was really, not happy with the money changers, that's one of those examples that we like to think where God, lost his temper and, or at least he was angry, with these people and throwing the tables around or whatever. That's kind of the imagery that we've been given. But there's part of this imagery that never gets filled in, and that is that when that happened, that the children were not afraid. This big contrast of when he went in there raising Cain, the children actually came to him and were praising him. He did not scare the children. And there was one example, of course, where he said, "Woe is anybody! You better have a millstone around your neck, jumping into the water if you're going to abuse children, essentially, not pay attention to them." I mean, we're given pretty pretty strict, direction about how we should be paying attention to our kids, which comes back to the creative spirit. All right. Does everyone know what parables are? I mean, what the purpose of parables and allegories? Christ used allegories. In Matthew 25:14 to 13, we won't read all those verses, but you all know the parable of the talents. How many of you have heard that parable used when it comes time to take up an offering in church? Okay. She's saying how many haven't heard that used in terms of church. It's amazing to me how many times it's been used for that reason. And yet, that's not what that parable is about in the least bit. It has nothing really to do with that. That parable is not about giving 100% of your money to the cause, as it were. Because that's what the parable says. I mean, you're supposed to invest 100%, does it not? Yeah. God has asked us to certainly consider the 10% the blessing we'll receive from it. But what's interesting to me, and the reason why you can bet, that it is not about that is because where it's placed in his ministry, it is placed right before his explanation of the great judgment and what's going to happen. It is the last parable he talks about before he talks about the great judgment day. At the end of this parable, the man who didn't invest, he feels the gnashing of teeth. And we know he is lost forever and that the great judgment day comes. And this parable is about the gifts, the creative gifts that we've been given, including spiritual gifts. This is about spiritual gifts in your creative spirit and how we are going to be held accountable if we do not give 100% of ourselves to our calling that God has given us. So it's not about the money thing, it's about our commitment and that he isn't going to settle for anything less than 100%. That is a pretty sobering thought to me. I used to chuckle when I hear people get up and use it as an offertory now, and now I think I just get plain sad because these people don't get it. They don't understand what this is really about. This is one of the more serious, in fact, to me, it's the most serious parable that Jesus shares. And I think there's no way of denying the fact, because where it comes right in that, before that great judgment day, he goes right into it. So, something again for us to consider. All right, let's get after it here. A Better Way. The book that I'm writing, that I've started to write, I believe the title is going to be A Man After My Own Heart. But it's about this creative spirit in the journey, and it certainly parallels the life of what David went through, as well as some other people. But in Isaiah 44:2, it says, I am your creator. You were in my care even before you were born. In a more traditional translation, it says, thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you in the womb, and he will help you. You know, God gives millions of parents babies, and I am as faultless as the next parent. But when my babies came out, my imagination is, that typical image of the dad putting a ball glove on the little baby, right when he's born. I wanted to see, I grew up playing baseball, I wanted to see my son, I wanted him to become this great athlete. Well, what happens if Caden isn't really meant to do that? What if he doesn't have that skill set or that natural ability? But as parents, we want to put our stamp, on them. We want to we tend to look as kids as blank slates when they come out. you know, that we're here to write our signature on it. And I want to offer you another alternative. Here's the question: do we make children in our images, or should we allow our children to follow their God-given identities? Does anybody want to comment about that? Anybody ever thought about that?
When teenagers are searching for their identity during the teen years, are they looking for something that doesn't exist? Or trying to find themselves?
Could they know that answer before they become teenagers?
And is that why some teens don't go through this type of conflict?
That's an interesting concept. Are the ones that don't go through that confusion, is it because they already know? In Proverbs, and we probably don't even need to look it up, but in Proverbs 22:6 is the big parental, you know, proverb. What is it? All right. And this is the big hammer. This is the big hammer that we use. But we need to be careful, because it doesn't mean that if I fill my child full of scripture, full of Sabbath schools and sermons, and yes, they may rebel, but eventually they'll come back around. Is that what that text means? Because that's the way most people treat it. If we hammer enough on them, if we just force them, you know, down this path, that they may jog off at some point, but they'll come back because we've indoctrinated them well enough. Well, let's break a few of these words down quickly here. In Proverbs 30, verses 18 and 19, the word way, if you look in the dictionary, means personal manner of behaving, acting, doing, aptitude, or facility. If you look at Proverbs 13, it's said there that he doesn't understand the way of the eagle, the way of the snake, the way of a ship on a sea. What do you think that means, the way, a person's way?
The manner in which they become who they are.
Yes, that's it. It's a manner. It's a manner. There's another word that we use called bent. And bent is used biblically. In Psalm 7:12, God bent his bow and made it ready. Well, if God is doing something to the baby in the womb in bending that bow has, if you know anything about archery, when you bend the bow and string it, it has a tension to it. It has a predetermined energy, right? The word bent is to assume a different direction or shape according to one's purpose. That's the definition. By the time a child is born, God has already bent him in a certain direction. So God hands us a preset bow that we as parents are to nurture until the day of his release. Raise the child in the way he should go. And Max Lucado, Christian writer, probably familiar to many, he says, we should not see our children, and I mentioned this earlier, as a blank slate waiting for our pen, but as a written book awaiting our study, studying them, discovering how God has designed them. Charles Swindoll writes in the book, You and Your Child, in every child God places in our arms, there is a bent, a set of characteristics already established. The bent is fixed and determined before he is given over to our care. The child is not, in fact, a pliable piece of clay. He has been set, he has been bent, and the parents who want to train this child correctly will discover that bent. Had my parents recognized when I was a child what my bent was, they could have set me on the path that I was designed to be, where I was supposed to be, my calling, much, much earlier. And I probably, hopefully, ideally, I wouldn't have had to go through that confusion in my teenage years, even younger, in that search. Does that make sense? How many of us have either gone through that or know people who have gone through that? My kids couldn't be more different. And I'm sure you've heard that a lot from parents. And yet, I see a commonality in their creative spirit and where that came from. And to me, that is the amazing part of the creative spirit, is that I can see that God bent their bows a certain direction. And so now, my wife and I are doing our best to nurture, to recognize what direction, they've been preset for. Which brings up a really good word, nurturing. In Ephesians 6:4 it says, "And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." And again, nurture means, when you look at the definition, something that nourishes, gives sustenance, to help grow and develop. And it comes from the Middle English language, and then older yet, Old French, and then older yet from Latin, is the act of suckling. To suckle. So, nurturing isn't molding. All right? Nurturing is not molding. A quote that has become very meaningful to me is a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King. "If a man hasn't discovered something worth dying for, he isn't fit to live." If a man hasn't discovered something worth dying for, he isn't fit to live. Dr. King was, to me, an incredibly insightful man in realizing, again, that we have a reason for being here. We have a purpose for being here. And it's our duty. If our parents didn't discover it for us, we've got to discover what it is. That's why I was standing on that cliff, because I hadn't discovered it at that point. So it's incumbent upon us, and again, I go back to that parable about the talents. We need to be accountable for that. Do you guys have any questions? Comments?
I have a question about the way that you're currently raising your children. Do your parents have any comments, about, do they reflect back on the way that they raised you? Do they see the correlation between, the way that you're real sensitive to your children's creative life and how you're listening to what you think, what your child is doing as opposed to.
I've not ever been asked that question before. That's my parents and even my sisters, when they see us handling our kids. Our kids, there's no doubt that they jump in and out of the lines frequently. And so when you see family members that are used to being inside the lines, they think you're being way too permissive, or you're not being authoritarian enough, or you may not be disciplining enough. And in the education system, I can already see for my two kids that are in preschool that one of them is going to be a square peg that I have to be very careful isn't going to be pounded into a round hole. And so we're looking at, some creative ways to get him educated in a way that is not going to crush him, And so that's at times at odds with the rest of our extended family. And they don't always know how to relate to that, and we try to encourage them to get involved and not be afraid to parent, because we do want their involvement. And we're trying to teach our kids that there are different styles of parenting, and that there are going to be times where they have to understand that they may get, their toes stepped on, proverbially, in terms of the creative spirit. And we talk to our kids, as young as they are, about the creative spirit. My daughter, Riley, at the age of 2.5, could discern the type of media that was okay for her to be watching. One of the things in the foundation that I had discovered, and one of the reasons for the foundation was that I believe that children should be held accountable for the media that they are exposed to. Not by restricting and taking away, because the average child today watches 8.5 hours of television a day. 8.5 hours. I don't even know how they can fit in 8.5 hours, but they're watching 8.5 hours. That was a study that came out. What's that?
It's average. So we don't-
That's average. That's right. That's average. And so in the year 2000, it was 7.5 hours. So it's gone up an hour in 5 years. So the paradigm of saying just say no isn't working. It hasn't worked, and it's not ever going to work. And it was just by sheer, maybe providence. I can't account it to anything else. But one day, my daughter, I'm sitting in my office, and I put on a VeggieTales movie for her. And she walks in, and I said, "Riley, what are you doing in here?" "Well, that's for big kids." I said, "What do you mean it's for big kids?" And she said, "Well, I think I'm a little bit scared, and I think it's for Katie." So I walked in there to see what was going on, and I realized at that moment, wait a minute, our children at that age especially are asking the question why. Why this? Why not? Why this? They're asking why, to the point we say just because, And I realized, and again, you guys, especially you're in social work, right? And he's a shrink, but the thing is what I realized was my children, especially Riley, and Caden too, but in this instance, Riley, they're processing information, and they're trying to reconcile the information that they're receiving. And so I thought, wait a minute, if I extrapolate this idea out that I have, why not try to empower my children, give them some tools to make some decisions, to hold them accountable? And so I did a little experiment with Riley. And sure enough, the experiment was, she was watching the Disney Channel one morning. I let her watch it, and a Barbie doll commercial came on, and she's wild about Barbie dolls. She's a little princess, and she loves Barbies. And so she said, "Oh, Daddy, I want that Barbie." Of course she does, And so I told her, I said, "Listen, honey, this is a commercial, and this is a company that's trying to sell you this Barbie. They want you to have this Barbie very badly, because we're going to give them money for this Barbie. And that's why they want you to have the Barbie. I'd like you to have the Barbie because I know how much you would like it, how much you enjoy it. But I just want you to know that when you see these things on TV, it's okay that you're going to see it, but just know they're going to try to sell you this Barbie." So she's nodding her head, and I'm thinking she probably really doesn't understand. She's 2.5. So we go to Toys R Us one day, and here's the Barbie in a big display, and there she says, "Daddy, there's that Barbie they were trying to sell me on television." And I was like, "All right." And then she said, "And I still want it." But, I was really encouraged by the fact that at least the trigger mechanism, I affected her trigger mechanism. And so it gave me a cornerstone to start building on that, and I have. And it is making a difference. There'll be times where, you know, as parents, you get lazy and you say, oh, go watch something on TV or something. And the next thing you know, they're watching something. It's like, I didn't tell you to watch, it was okay to watch that, but with Riley, it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened yet. She'll watch, Caden will turn on the program on something he wants to watch. And she'll come back and say, I said, what are you doing? Well, Caden's watching the Big Boy Show. So it's not that I'm going to entrust her with her life and everything. I mean, there's obviously things I need to continue nurturing her, and Rebecca does as well. But these are tools that we can give our children to nurture their creative spirit and yet hold them accountable and hopefully have more function than the way that I grew up. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else? And then I think we'll get towards wrapping up. Anybody else have any comments? Or Christian, how do you?
When we come back, we just talk about molding one more.
You sure? Wait, I want to pick on you a minute. What kind of environment did you grow up in?
It was very positive and supportive. I was homeschooled all the way through high school. They tried to create a curriculum for me where we integrate every little thing. Like, for example, for studying the Revolutionary War, we were the American Revolution, and we were very fascinated by it. So they would take us to Lexington on weekends and stuff, so we could see the reenactments and see things. So I was always able to see what I'm learning in action in a way. So it was very
Good. As a parent, how did you deal with your kids in education?
They went to school mostly. We did a little bit of homeschooling. I wish I had homeschooled more.
Really?
I really did.
Why do you say that?
Because I have seen a lot of homeschool children and their parents, and I have come to really, really admire that. I think that they have a lot more freedom for creativity. I think that they generally do better scholastically even. I think it helps them to have a better sense of self, they don't have the pressures, and I mean, kids at school can be very mean. And my son had some experiences where he was treated terribly. I don't think it still affects him. And they just don't, but I just think it's a very positive thing. I'm not a good
Okay.
speaker.
Well, that's all right. Let's talk about molding. You have a thought or comment?
I look at molding in a little different manner than you're presenting it for me.
Okay.
I look at molding more as is a sculptor or a stone cutter who in fact is looking and thinking about what the stone actually is, what the image contained within the stone really is, and is simply a person who is taking off the extraneous matter that keeps the stone from being what it truly is.
So peeling back the onion, so to speak.
Right. I guess I look at molding more in that framework than in trying to fit something into a round hole when it's a square.
Right. And I think that's a valid point. I'm often asked on the DOS documentary, I had 150 hours of material to edit down into an hour and 40 minutes. And I'm often asked the question, how did you even deal with that enormous amount of material? And I address it just like what you said in terms of the sculptures. How does the sculptress know the first tap on that hammer, with the hammer on that chisel and that block? How does he know how hard to hit and where to go? And as an artist, and you're going to be getting one coming up here who I'm friends with, who is a sculptress, and he and I have talked about this actually. It's okay for me to say his name?
Pardon?
Is it okay for me to say his name?
Sure.
Oh, Wayne Hazen. Wayne and I have talked about this. As much as we have this vision in our head, you still have to, it still is not concrete. It can't be concrete because it's in my head. I call it letting the animal reveal itself. peeling back the onion, in other words. It wasn't until I spent weeks and months, you know, with my editors, peeling back the onion, that all of a sudden the documentary began to take shape. And elements, I knew I would never change a frame, and other ones I was like, oh my goodness, you know, this has got to go, and you know, you still keep chipping away. And so the molding part, you know, I can live with, you know, what you're saying. I mean, in that respect, I think in children, usually by definition, most people don't know how to nurture, you know, and I think we're talking the same thing. So that's why I tend to use that term probably more so, because the other carries more of a concrete, you know, image for people. But that's a really good point. I'm ready to, yes.
Judge Scales, can we take like a?
I'm ready, done.
Break? Okay. Well then, I was gonna say, cause question and answers, there's a lot of stuff.
Well, if you have questions, I'm willing to